Hey guys, tonight we're going to step back in time, not just into history, but into one of history's most sophisticated and quietest marketing campaigns. We're heading to 14th century Japan, a time of beautiful art and brutal politics, to see how a group of military leaders, the Ashikaga Shoguns, used things like rock gardens and tea ceremonies to build a brand of power when their actual power was, to put it mildly, a little shaky. If you were dropped into this era, your modern sensibilities probably wouldn't save you. You'd be a walking, talking target in a world of silent rules and sharp swords. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support truly helps this quiet corner of the internet grow. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet thrill to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're standing in the mud-slicked streets of 14th century Kyoto. The air itself feels thin, humming with a nervous energy. The city is the heart of Japan, the home of the emperor, but it doesn't feel settled. It feels like a city holding its breath. This is the stage for our story, and you've arrived just as the new management is taking over. They're called the Ashikaga clan, and their leader, Ashikaga Takeuchi, has just become the shogun, the supreme military ruler of all Japan. But there's a problem. A huge one. This was the clean promotion. It was a messy, backstabbing, complicated affair. This is the first, most crucial piece of our story. The Ashikaga Shogunate was born from betrayal. The previous government, based in a city called Kamekoka, had grown weak. The emperor, a man named Kodego, saw his chance to restore direct imperial rule. He called on loyal samurai to help him, and one of the most powerful generals to answer that call was our man, Ashikaga Takeuchi. They succeeded. They toppled the old regime. But then, in a stunning power play, Takeuchi turned on the very emperor he had just helped, drove him out of Kyoto, and installed a rival emperor who was more compliant. He then had this new, friendly emperor grant him the title of shogun. So right from the start, their brand launch was a public relations nightmare. Half the country saw them not as legitimate rulers, but as opportunistic traitors. You can feel it in the streets. The guards on the corners don't stand with the relaxed confidence of an established power. They stand with the tense, darting eyes of men who expect to fight at any moment. The foundation of their rule isn't solid rock. It's sinking sand. And here is a little detail that really paints the picture of their instability. A bit of a weird fact for you. For many of the early years, the Ashikaga shogun lost, even the undisputed master of his own capital city. Rival clans, loyal to the Emperor Takeuchi at exile, still had mansions undawned retinues right here in Kyoto. You might see a procession of their samurai, marching proudly down the main avenue, banners flying, while the shogun's own men watch from a distance, unable or unwilling to challenge them. It was like a CEO being forced to share his headquarters with a hostile competitor who constantly reminds everyone that he thinks the CEO is a fraud. They had the title, but they didn't have total control, not even on their home turf. This created a constant, low-grade anxiety that permeated everything. They cowed and drew by force alone. They had tried that, and it led to decades of civil war. They needed something else. They needed to convince people, the other powerful warlords, the snooty court nobles, and maybe even themselves, that their rule was not just a temporary victory, but the correct, natural order of things. They needed to project an aura of stability, sophistication, and destiny. They needed more than swords. They needed a narrative. They needed to build a brand. And this is where historians still pull their hair out, a point of endless debate. When did the Ashikaga truly become the government in people's minds? Was it the moment Takayuji won his final battle? Or was it a much slower process, a gradual acceptance that took generations? The academic consensus leans toward the latter. The Ashikaga's legitimacy was a project, not a given. It had to be carefully constructed, piece by piece, not on the battlefield, but in the cultural heart of the nation. They had to prove they were more than just the strongest gang in town. They had to prove they had the right to rule. And to do that, they would turn to some very unusual and, as well see, very powerful tools. The first step was to acknowledge the problem. The throne was shaking, and they needed a way to steady it. That shaky throne wasn't just a figure of speech. It was a literal, political reality, and it has a name, the Nanboku-cho period. It means the period of the northern and southern courts. And for you, living under Ashikaga rule in Kyoto, it's the source of all the tension in the air. It's the central, nagging problem that defines everything. Because when Ashikaga Takayuji kicked out Emperor Go-Daigo didn't just vanish. He fled south, deep into the rugged, misty mountains of Yoshino, and he set up a rival imperial court. So now, you have two men calling themselves Emperor of Japan. One is here in Kyoto, backed by the Ashikaga's military might. The Northern Emperor. The other is down south, surrounded by loyalist clans and holding onto a claim of pure, unbroken legitimacy. The Southern Emperor. For nearly 60 years, this division will tear the country apart. Every major samurai clan, every local warlord, every ambitious landholder has to make a choice. Who do you support? The guy with the bigger army right now, or the guy with what many believe is the holier, more rightful claim? Imagine trying to run a company with another person. The founder you just forced out has set up a rival headquarters and is actively trying to poach your clients and executives, all while claiming to be the real CEO. That was the Ashikaga's daily headache. The war was just fought on battlefields with swords and arrows. It was a war of legitimacy, a battle for the heart and soul of the nation's elite. The Southern Court's brand was simple and powerful. Tradition, divine right, and righteous defiance. They were the keepers of the true flame. The Ashikaga's brand, by contrast, was one of pragmatic, military power. It was effective, but it lacked a certain magic. And here's a wonderfully weird, almost unbelievable little fact that made the Ashikaga's branding problem so much worse. To be a true emperor of Japan, you need to possess the three sacred treasures, a sword, a mirror, and a jewel, all said to have been handed down from the sun goddess herself. They are the physical proof of your divine connection and right to rule. Well, when Emperor Go-Daigo fled to the mountains, he took the real sacred treasures with him. This meant that the Emperor the Ashikaga had sitting on the throne in Kyoto, the very source of their shogunal authority, was crowned with a set of fakes. They had a replica emperor, legitimized by replica treasures. It's the ultimate ancient world example of fake it till you make it. Everyone in power knew it, whispered about it in the halls and tea rooms. The Ashikaga government was, in a very literal sense, built on a forgery. This put you, as an observer in Kyoto, in a strange position. You see the power of the Ashikaga guards on the street. You see the construction of their grand mansions, but you also hear the rumors. You know that deep in the forests to the south, the real court is plotting its return. Every strange weather event, every earthquake, every famine is interpreted by some as a sign that the heavens are displeased with the usurpers in Kyoto. The Ashikaga couldn't just ignore this. They had to create a counter-narrative so powerful it could make people forget about the empty box where the real treasures were supposed to be. This is a place where historians still have lively debates. How much did the average samurai or warlord truly care about the divine legitimacy of the Southern Court versus the practical benefits offered by the Northern Court? Was their allegiance based on deeply held beliefs about the imperial line, passed down through their families? Or was it pure opportunism, a cold calculation of who was more likely to reward them with land and titles? The truth is likely a messy combination of both. Some clans had historical ties to one imperial line or another, while others switched sides as freely as you might switch your internet provider today, constantly looking for a better deal. It shows that even in an age of supposed divine rule, practical politics and personal gain were powerful motivators. The Ashikaga couldn't solve this problem with brute force. The war dragged on and on, a bloody, expensive stalemate. It became clear that winning this conflict required more than a strong army. It required a stronger idea. They needed to project an image of such profound stability, cultural superiority, and enlightened wisdom that the question of the sacred treasures would start to feel irrelevant. They had to make their court in Kyoto not just the center of power, but the undeniable center of civilization. They had to build a brand so compelling that it would become the new reality. They couldn't out-tradition the southern court, so they would have to out-culture them. So, who was the man behind this new, shaky enterprise? Who was the first CEO of Ashikaga Inc.? His name was Ashikaga Takayuji, and if you were to meet him, you probably wouldn't think sophisticated brand strategist. You'd think warrior. Everything about him screamed samurai, from the calluses on his hands to the way his eyes constantly scanned the room for threats. He was a man of the battlefield, born into one of the most prestigious warrior families, a branch of the Minamoto clan who had founded the very first shogunate centuries earlier. This lineage was his one solid brand asset. It gave him credibility in a world obsessed with bloodlines. But his personality was a bundle of contradictions. He was a simple brute. Historical accounts describe him as being incredibly generous, often to a fault. He was known to give away his own horses, dorme, and even the clothes off his back to reward his followers. This made his men intensely loyal to him personally, which was a huge advantage. He was a charismatic leader who inspired devotion. But this same generosity made him a terrible administrator. He was famously bad with money and had little interest in the boring, day-to-day details of governing. Things like tax collection, legal codes, and infrastructure projects. For you, living in his capital, this would be frustratingly obvious. The city's defenses might be strong, but the roads are a mess, and justice seems to depend entirely on who has the shogun's ear that day. Takayuji's rise to power was a masterclass in political maneuvering that left a trail of broken allegiances. As we touched on, he first helped Emperor Go-Daigo topple the old Kamakura Shogunate, and then, in a stunning reversal, he turned on that same emperor to seize power for himself. This act of betrayal would define his legacy. While it secured him the ultimate prize, it also cemented his reputation as a man whose loyalty could not be trusted. His brand was stable and reliable. It was brilliant but unpredictable. He was the brilliant general you wanted on your side in a battle, but maybe not the guy you'd trust with your life savings. Now for a fascinating and very humanizing little detail about this warrior ruler. Takayuji was said to be deeply, personally tormented by the consequences of his actions. He was a devout Buddhist, and the constant warfare, the betrayals, and the sheer number of deaths he was responsible for weighed heavily on his conscience. It's said that he commissioned the building of temples and the copying of sutras specifically to appease the spirits of the men who had died in his wars, both his enemies and his own soldiers. One of his most famous projects was the establishment of a network of temples and pagodas across the country, called Ankokuji and Isho, dedicated to bringing peace to the nation and comforting the souls of the dead. It was a form of spiritual PR, an attempt to balance his karmic debt. It shows a man who was a simple power-hungry tyrant, but a complex individual grappling with the moral cost of his ambition. This internal conflict is at the heart of a long-standing historical debate. Was Ashikaga Takayuji a cynical opportunist or a reluctant ruler? Some historians, looking at his bold betrayals, paint him as a purely ambitious man who cleverly manipulated events to place his family at the pinnacle of power. They see his religious piety as a political performance, a way to soften his ruthless image. But other scholars, reading his personal writings and analyzing his actions, see a man caught in the currents of a chaotic time, forced to make difficult choices to protect his family and his followers. They argue that he was a product of his era, a time when loyalty was fluid and survival depended on making tough, sometimes dishonorable, decisions. The truth, as is often the case, is probably somewhere in the murky middle. He was likely both a brilliant strategist and a man burdened by the path he chose. Takayuji was the founder. He laid the military groundwork. He won the battles that put his family on the throne, and he held it through sheer force of will and personal charisma. But he was not the man who would build the enduring Ashikaga brand. He was too much of a warrior, too much a man of action. He solved problems with a sword. The long-term problem of legitimacy, of making the Ashikaga feel like the rightful rulers, would require a different set of skills. He was the CEO who engineered the hostile takeover. Now, the company needed a new kind of leader, a visionary who could handle the marketing and rebrand the entire enterprise. That task would fall to his grandson, a man who understood that power was just held in castles, but also projected from golden pavilions. The man who truly understood the power of branding, the one who took his grandfather's shaky military venture and turned it into a cultural powerhouse, was the third shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu. If Takayuji was the gritty startup founder, Yoshimitsu was the polished, second-generation CEO who takes the company public. When you think of the Ashikaga Shogunate at its peak, glittering and powerful, you are thinking of Yoshimitsu Esara. He came to power as a child, and for you, living in Kyoto during his reign, it would have been like watching the city itself transform. The nervous, tense energy of his grandfather's time slowly gives way to an air of ostentatious confidence. Yoshimitsu was a master of spectacle. He understood that to be seen as the true ruler of Japan, he had to act the part, and on a grander scale than anyone else. He was just a shogun. He cultivated the image of a universal ruler, a patron of the arts, a statesman, and a near-divine figure. He held extravagant poetry contests, sponsored grand theatrical performances, and hosted elaborate processions that snaked through the streets of Kyoto, designed to awed both the common folk and the rival warlords who came to the capital. His every public appearance was a calculated performance. His ultimate marketing masterpiece, the physical embodiment of his brand strategy, was the Kinkaikuji, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. You would have watched it being built on the northern outskirts of Kyoto, a retirement villa so stunning it immediately became the symbol of the age. Imagine seeing it for the first time. It's not just a building, it's a statement. The top two floors are completely covered in gold leaf, shimmering in the sun and reflecting perfectly in the mirror pond below. It was an act of audacious, unapologetic blind in an era that often praised subtlety. It was designed to be breathtaking, to signal a level of wealth and power that was simply beyond the reach of any of his rivals. But the Kinkaikuji was more than just a display of wealth. Its design was a brilliant piece of propaganda. Each of its 3 floors was built in a different architectural style. The first floor was done in the Ascendant style, the domestic architecture of the old imperial court aristocracy. This was a nod to the traditional elites, a signal that he respected their culture. The second floor was built in the Byukeika style, the style of a samurai house, representing his own warrior class and the source of his military power. And the top floor, that was built in the style of a Chinese Zen hall. This was the most audacious claim of all. It associated him with the profound wisdom and international sophistication of Zen Buddhism. In one building, he had symbolically unified the 3 most powerful cultural forces in Japan: the court, the warriors, and the Zen establishment, all under his own golden roof. It was a visual mission statement. And here's a fantastic little detail about Yoshimitsu's ambition. His power moves weren't just confined to Japan. He restarted formal trade and diplomatic relations with Ming Dynasty China, a huge and very profitable enterprise. In his correspondence with the Chinese emperor, he accepted the title King of Japan. Now this was hugely controversial. In the Japanese system, only the emperor was a sovereign. The shogun was his military deputy. By calling himself a king in the eyes of the Chinese, Yoshimitsu was effectively placing himself on an equal footing with his own emperor, and some historians argue he was even positioning himself as superior. It was a diplomatic power play that further blurred the lines of who was really in charge, all while filling his coffers with the profits from international trade, which in turn paid for things like the Golden Pavilion. This ambition is where the historical debate about Yoshimitsu really heats up. Was he simply a very effective shogun who strengthened his government, or was he actively trying to usurp the imperial throne itself? Some historians believe that if he had lived longer, he might have tried to become emperor, or create a new kind of joint rulership. They point to the fact that he had his wife given a title normally reserved for an empress, and that he made his son go through ceremonies usually reserved for imperial princes. He was behaving less like a shogun and more like a monarch. Others argue this is reading too much into it. They suggest he was simply using the trappings of royalty to elevate the office of shogun, not to steal the throne. He wanted the shogunate to be seen as a permanent, legitimate, and quasi-royal institution, ensuring his family has power for generations. The question of his ultimate ambition remains one of the great what-ifs of Japanese history. Yoshimitsu's greatest achievement was ending the division that had plagued the country for decades. In 1392, through a mix of force and clever negotiation, he finally persuaded the southern court to give up its claim and return the sacred treasures to Kyoto, unifying the imperial line. It was a monumental success. He had solved the problem that his grandfather had created. The shaky throne was now, for a time, stable, and he had done it not just with swords, but with style. He had made the Ashikaga brand so dazzling, so culturally dominant, that the rival brands simply faded away. He proved that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a sword, but a golden pavilion, a key part of Yoshimitsu's brilliant branding strategy, and that of the Ashikaga in general, was a decision his grandfather Taka Uji had made right at the beginning, where to set up the company headquarters. The first shogunate, the Kameturka, had deliberately established its base far from the imperial capital, in the coastal town of Kamekurka. This was to keep their rugged warrior culture pure and away from the supposedly softening, decadent influence of the imperial court in Kyoto. It was a conscious separation. The Ashikaga, however, did the exact opposite. They planted their government, the Bakush, right in the heart of Kyoto, often just a few blocks away from the emperor's own palace. For you, standing in the Muromachi district of the city, this decision changes everything. This isn't a distant military government anymore. It's your neighbor. You see the shogun's top officials and their samurai retinues on the same streets as the pale, elegantly robed court nobles. Their mansions are being built side by side. It creates a fascinating, and sometimes tense, fusion of two very different worlds. The rough, practical culture of the warriors begins to blend with the ancient, hyper-refined culture of the aristocracy. Samurai start taking an interest in poetry and flower arranging, while court nobles have to get used to the constant presence of armed men. This was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. The risk was that the shoguns and their followers would go soft, lose their military edge, and get entangled in the web of courtly intrigue. But the reward, which the Ashikaga clearly felt was worth it, was immense. By placing themselves at the center of cultural life, they could co-opt it. They could become the new tastemakers. Power in Japan didn't just flow from the sword, it also flowed from controlling the cultural narrative. And Kyoto was, without question, the ultimate stage for that. To be the master of Kyoto was to be the master of high culture. They weren't just in the same city. They physically dominated it. The shoguns built their residences to be imposing architectural statements. Yoshimitsu's palace, nicknamed the Hanano-gusho or Palace of Flowers, was a sprawling complex that was said to be even more magnificent than the emperor's own residence. Imagine the message that sends. The employee has a bigger, fancier office than the chairman of the board. It's a subtle but constant reminder of who holds the real, practical power. The emperor might have the divine title, but the shogun has the resources to build paradise on earth. Here's a curious little detail that shows just how intertwined these two worlds became. They knew. Hybrid culture emerged among the elites in Kyoto. It was a blend of Kuji-e court nobility and Buk-e warrior nobility tastes. This fusion is visible in everything from fashion to art. For instance, the formal, stately tradition of court poetry might now include themes of warrior life, of loyalty and impermanence on the battlefield. Conversely, a fearsome warlord, fresh from a campaign, might spend his evening meticulously preparing for a tea ceremony or agonizing over the correct placement of a single flower in a vase. This blending was the direct result of the shogun's decision to move into the neighborhood. They didn't just observe the culture of Kyoto. They actively participated in it, and in doing so, they reshaped it in their own image. The success of this move to the capital strategy is a subject of ongoing historical discussion. Did the Ashikaga truly manage to dominate the court culture, or did it end up dominating them? Some historians argue that the shoguns, especially the later ones, became so obsessed with art, poetry, and aesthetics that they neglected the basics of governing. They argue that the move to Kyoto was the beginning of the end, as the shoguns lost touch with their provincial warrior base and became just another faction of refined, out-of-touch Kyoto elites. The incredible cultural flourishing they sponsored came at the cost of their military and political power. Other historians disagree, arguing this is a false dichotomy. They contend that for the Ashikaga, cultural patronage was politics. In their view, sponsoring a no play where a rock garden was the distraction from governing. It was a fundamental to love it. It was how they demonstrated their fitness to rule to a very specific and very powerful audience of rival warlords and courtiers. Ultimately, by setting up shop in Kyoto, the Ashikaga put themselves at the epicenter of prestige. They could now directly influence and sponsor the greatest artists, poets, and performers of the day. They could host the most exclusive parties. They could set the trends. This proximity to the imperial court, which their predecessors had shunned, became their greatest branding asset. It allowed them to wrap their raw military power in layers of silk, poetry, and exquisite taste. Now they had the perfect stage. The next step was to choose the perfect philosophy to be the soul of their new brand. A philosophy that was disciplined, sophisticated, and perfectly suited to the warrior mindset. They chose Zen. Having established their headquarters in the cultural capital, the Ashikaga needed an ideological partner, a brand soul that would give their rule intellectual and spiritual weight. They found it in Zen Buddhism. For you, living in Kyoto at the time, the influence of Zen would have felt like it was everywhere, from the new temples being built with stark, powerful lines, to the conversations you'd overhear in the market about meditation and enlightenment. It was the philosophy of the era, and the shoguns hitched their wagon to it with incredible savvy. So why Zen? Why not one of the older, more established Buddhist sects that had been popular with the imperial court for centuries? The choice was a brilliant strategic move for several reasons. First, Zen was relatively new and fresh in Japan. It didn't have the deep, centuries-old ties to the imperial court and the old aristocracy that other sects did. This made it a perfect fit for a new ruling power that was trying to distinguish itself from the old guard. By championing Zen, the Ashikaga were signaling a break with the past and the dawn of a new era. It was the philosophical equivalent of a tech startup choosing a sleek, modern brand identity over a stuffy, traditional one. Second, the core tenets of Zen resonated deeply with the samurai mindset. Zen emphasizes discipline, self-control, and the importance of direct experience over bookish learning. It teaches that enlightenment can be found in the midst of everyday activities, through intense focus and dedication. For a warrior whose life depends on split-second decisions and absolute mental clarity in the face of death, this was an incredibly appealing philosophy. It provided a spiritual framework that validated and elevated their way of life. It suggested that the path of the sword, if followed with the right mindset, could also be a path to spiritual awakening. It made being a warrior seem not just necessary, but noble and profound. You can see this partnership in action all over Kyoto. The shoguns poured money and land grants into a specific network of Zen temples, known as the Gozen, or the Five Mountains system. This was a hierarchical organization of major Zen monasteries, with the most prestigious ones located right in Kyoto, under the direct patronage and, crucially, the direct control of the shogun. These weren't just places of worship. They became quasi-governmental agencies. The shogun appointed the head abbots, and the temples, in turn, provided the government with educated, literate, and loyal administrators. And here's a fantastic, slightly counterintuitive tidbit. These Zen monasteries were the hubs of international trade because of their deep connections to China, the homeland of Zen. The monks were often the only ones with the linguistic skills and contacts to manage the lucrative trade missions we talked about with Yoshimitsu. So when the shogun wanted to send a fleet of ships to China to trade Japanese swords and fans for Chinese silk and porcelain, the whole mission was often organized and staffed by Zen monks. It's a strange image, robed monks acting as international diplomats, trade negotiators, and financial advisors. But it made the Zen establishment incredibly wealthy and powerful, and it tied their success directly to the success of the Ashikaga Shogunate. Their partnership was not just spiritual, it was economic. This close relationship between the shogunate and the Zen establishment has led to a fascinating historical debate. Was the Ashikaga's patronage of Zen a matter of genuine religious belief, or was it a cynical political calculation? Some historians argue that shoguns like Takayuji and Yoshimitsu were truly devout followers of Zen, who found personal solace and spiritual guidance in its teachings. They see the temples and art they commissioned as authentic expressions of their faith. But other historians take a more critical view. They argue that the Ashikaga primarily saw Zen as a tool of statecraft. They used it to legitimize their rule, to create a loyal administrative class, and to control profitable foreign trade. In this view, the shogun's faith was secondary to the political and economic benefits that the Zen partnership provided. As with so many of these questions, the answer is likely a complex mix of both genuine belief and shrewd politics. Whatever the primary motivation, the result was clear. Zen became the official aesthetic and intellectual brand of the Ashikaga Shogunate. It provided a powerful counter-narrative to the traditional, courtly culture of the emperor. The shogun's brand was now associated with discipline, with deep, intuitive wisdom, and with a sophisticated, international outlook. They had their stage in Kyoto. They had their brand philosophy in Zen. Now they needed the people who could turn that philosophy into a tangible reality. They needed the creatives, the artists and intellectuals who could translate the abstract ideas of Zen into gardens, paintings, and plays. And they found them in the most convenient place possible, the very monasteries they were funding. With the brand strategy in place, ruled from Kyoto, powered by Zen philosophy, the Ashikaga needed an in-house creative department. They needed people who could translate these ideas into compelling content, and they found the perfect candidates, the Zen monks themselves, particularly the highly educated elite who resided in the Gozen temples you saw the shoguns funding so lavishly. For you, these monks would be a common and respected sight in the capital, but their role went far beyond religious services. They were the poets, the painters, the calligraphers, the garden designers, and the political advisors of the age. They were the secret weapon of the Ashikaga branding machine. These weren't just simple ascetics who spent all day meditating. The leading monks of the 5 mountains were the intellectual superstars of their time. They had to be masters of complex Chinese literature and poetry, as this was the language of Zen scripture and high culture. They were expected to be skilled in calligraphy and ink painting, which were seen as direct expressions of one's Zen mind. Many were also experts in things like landscape design and even architecture. In an era before universities, these monasteries were the premier centers of learning and culture in Japan. They were the Ivy League of the 14th and 15th centuries. The shogun would consult with these monks on matters of state. He would commission them to compose official documents and letters, especially those going to China. He would invite them to his palace for poetry gatherings that were part intellectual salon, part political networking event. If you were an ambitious provincial warlord visiting Kyoto, getting a private tour of a major Zen temple with the head abbot was just a cultural experience. It was a sign that you were in the inner circle. The shogun was using these monks to create an exclusive club of sophistication, and he was the gatekeeper. And here's a wonderful, specific example of this creative partnership that you might witness: the practice of shikajiku. This was a type of hanging scroll that was incredibly popular in elite circles. It would feature a subtle, evocative ink painting at its center, perhaps a misty landscape or a single bird on a branch. Above the painting, there would be a series of poems written by several different high-ranking Zen monks, and maybe even the shogun himself, all in exquisite calligraphy. The poems would riff on the theme of the painting. Owning one of these scrolls was the ultimate status symbol. It showed that you were not only wealthy enough to commission it, but also connected enough to get the most famous creatives of the day to contribute. It was the 15th century equivalent of having a piece of art co-signed by Banksy, a Nobel laureate poet, and the president. This deep involvement of Zen monks in the arts and politics of the Ashikaga Shogunate leads to a curious historical question that is still debated. Were these men primarily monks who happened to be artists, or were they artists and administrators who happened to be monks? The lines became incredibly blurry. Some of these figures, like the famous monk Muso Soseki, were deeply religious men who also happened to be brilliant garden designers and trusted advisors to shoguns and emperors. His primary identity was arguably that of a Zen master. But later in the period, you find figures who seem to have entered the monastery less out of a fervent spiritual calling and more because it was the best career path for a bright, ambitious man who was born into the top warrior aristocracy. The monastery was a gateway to power and influence. It raises the question of whether the Zen brand, over time, became more of a cultural style than a deeply felt spiritual practice for some of its most famous practitioners. So you have this incredible concentration of talent, all gathered in Kyoto, all working under the patronage of the shogun. The shogun gives them money, land, and prestige. In return, they provide him with administrative skills, diplomatic connections, and, most importantly, a steady stream of brand assets, koans, paintings, and ideas that reinforce his image as an enlightened and cultured ruler. This creative partnership was the engine room of the Ashikaga-esque cultural project. It was now time for this engine to produce its first, and perhaps most radical, piece of advertising, an art form so minimalist and strange that it would force everyone to stop and reconsider the very nature of beauty, order, and power. It was time to build a garden with no flowers. With the creative team of Zen monks assembled, it was time for the Ashikaga brand to launch its most iconic and daring product line, the KR Sansui, or the Dry Landscape Garden. Imagine you're a samurai lord visiting Kyoto for the first time, used to gardens filled with colorful flowers, blossoming trees, and pleasant streams. You're taken by a high-ranking monk to see the shogun's newest cultural project, located in the courtyard of a quiet Zen temple. You walk through a gate and you stop, confused. There are no flowers. There are no trees. There isn't even any water. Before you is a star, flat rectangle of carefully raked white gravel, out of which emerge a few arrangements of large, moss-flecked rocks. That's it. Your first reaction might be a bit of a letdown. Is this a joke? Is the garden unfinished? But the monk beside you is looking at it with an expression of profound concentration. And you realize this isn't an absence of a garden. This is the garden. This was the radical new advertisement for the Ashikaga Zen brand. It was a complete rejection of the lush, decorative, and colorful garden style favored by the old court aristocracy. The old gardens were about sensual pleasure, the scent of blossoms, the sound of water. This new type of garden was about something else entirely. It was intellectual, abstract, and demanding. This minimalist aesthetic was a direct expression of Zen philosophy. Zen teaches that enlightenment comes from seeing the essence of reality, not from being distracted by its surface-level beauty. By stripping the garden down to its most basic elements, rock, sand, and moss, the designers were forcing you, the viewer, to engage with it on a deeper level. The reeks and was just sand. It represented water, the vast emptiness of the ocean or the flowing currents of a river. The rocks weren't just rocks. They were islands, mountains, or even mythical creatures like tigers and dragons. The garden wasn't a picture to be passively looked at. It was a cosmic landscape to be contemplated, a meditative tool. This was an incredibly bold brand statement. It communicated a set of very specific values. First, it projected discipline and order. The meticulously raked lines in the sand, which had to be maintained daily by the monks, were a visual representation of the mental discipline central to Zen. They implied a world where everything was in its proper place, under control, a subtle but powerful message from a government that was trying to impose order on a chaotic country. Second, it projected sophistication. Understanding a rock garden required a certain level of cultural and philosophical knowledge. It was for everyone. It was for the initiated, the enlightened. To get it was to signal that you were part of the elite club. And here's a wonderfully quirky fact that highlights the seriousness of this new art form. The selection and placement of the rocks was the most crucial part of the process, and it was guided by esoteric manuals, some of which were originally from China. These manuals, like the famous Sokuchi-iki, gave incredibly specific, almost mystical, rules for how to arrange stones. For example, a rock should never be placed in a dead position, flat on the ground. There should always be a sense of tension and movement. Stones were seen as having distinct personalities and energies. A tall, vertical stone might be male, while a low, reclining one might be female. The garden designer was less of a landscaper and more of a cosmic choreographer, balancing the fundamental forces of the universe within a small, enclosed space. The true meaning and origin of this stark style are still debated by art historians and garden experts. Was the K.R. Sansuya direct import from Song Dynasty China, inspired by their monochrome landscape paintings? Or was it a uniquely Japanese innovation, a radical leap that had no direct precedent? Some scholars trace a clear lineage from Chinese landscape art, arguing that the three-dimensional gardens are simply attempts to recreate the two-dimensional paintings in real space. Others argue that while the Chinese influence is undeniable, the extreme minimalism of gardens like our Ōnin is a purely Japanese development, a product of the specific cultural and religious currents of the Ashikaga period. The truth is likely that it was a fusion, an idea that originated in China but was refined and perfected into its ultimate minimalist form in Japan. So as you stand there, staring at this strange, empty garden, you start to understand. This isn't about horticulture. It's about power. It's the Ashikaga Shogunate saying, "We are not like the old rulers. We are not distracted by frivolous beauty. Our power is based on something deeper, more essential, more profound. It's as solid and timeless as these rocks, as orderly and controlled as this rake sand. If you don't understand it, that's your problem. no towers. It was a form of advertising so confident, it bordered on arrogant, and it would become one of the most enduring symbols of their reign. As you continue to stare at the strange, flowerless garden, the Zen monk at your side might begin to quietly explain what you're supposed to be seeing. You're not just looking at rocks and sand, you're reading a message. These dry gardens were packed with symbolism, and understanding that symbolism was key to appreciating the Shogun's brand. The message was multi-layered, speaking of Zen philosophy, Chinese legends, and, most importantly, the right to rule. The most common interpretation, the one the monk would likely share with you, is that the garden is a landscape in miniature. The raked white gravel, gold Shirakawa Sane, represents water. The precise, linear patterns raked into it suggest the stillness of a calm sea, while swirling, concentric patterns around the base of a rock might represent the ripples in a pond. The rocks themselves are the land. A cluster of stones becomes a chain of islands. A single, tall stone becomes a sacred mountain. Perhaps Mount Hora, the mythical island of the Taoist immortals, a place of eternal life. In this view, the garden is a representation of the entire world, or at least a purified, idealized version of it. By creating this miniature cosmos, the shogun, as the garden's patron, was making a huge claim. He was positioning himself not just as a military leader, but as a cosmoseer, a ruler whose power brings order to the universe itself. He is the one who can create a perfect, harmonious world, even if it's just within the walls of a temple courtyard. For a visiting warlord from the provinces, whose own lands might be plagued by strife and uncertainty, the message would be clear. The shogun presides over a world of perfect order and tranquility. Ally with him, and you can be part of this harmony. Oppose him, and you are choosing chaos. But there are other, more specific stories being told in the stones. A very popular theme was the tiger-cub crossing. In this arrangement, a group of rocks represents a mother tiger leading her cubs across a dangerous river. According to the legend, the mother tiger has to transport her cubs one by one, but one of the cubs is vicious and will attack the others if left alone with them. The arrangement of the rocks is meant to represent the solution to this ancient riddle, a visual puzzle demonstrating wisdom and strategic thinking. It's a perfect metaphor for a ruler. A shogun must be both fierce like a tiger and wise enough to navigate complex problems to protect his people or, in this case, his cubs, vassals. And here's a small but fascinating detail that adds another layer to this. The very texture of the rocks was important. The designers preferred dark, rugged stones, often weathered and covered with patches of moss or lichen. This wasn't just for looks. It was an aesthetic choice that connected to the emerging wabi-sabi sensibility, an appreciation for things that are imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. The moss suggested the passage of time, the beauty of aging. It was a quiet rejection of the new, the shiny, the perfect. This was a sophisticated brand message. It suggested that the shogun's power was a fleeting, human phenomenon. It was ancient, weathered, and deeply rooted, like the stones themselves. The exact symbolic meaning of any given garden, however, is a topic of endless scholarly debate, particularly for the most famous ones. Did the original designers have a single, specific story in mind, like the tiger cub legend, or were the arrangements meant to be more abstract, allowing each viewer to project their own meaning onto them? Some modern scholars argue that we overinterpret these gardens, that we're projecting complex literary allegories onto what was primarily an exercise in abstract composition and spatial dynamics. They suggest the designers were more like abstract sculptors, concerned with balance, rhythm, and form, than they were storytellers. Others maintain that for a 15th century audience steeped in Chinese and Japanese legends, these symbolic readings would have been obvious and intentional. Regardless of the specific intent, the overall message was one of control. The garden is a wild landscape that has been tamed, abstracted, and perfected. Nature, in all its chaotic and untamed glory, has been reduced to its essential forms and placed into a human-made framework of perfect order. You, the viewer, are positioned outside of it, looking in. You cannot enter the garden. Walking on the rakes and is forbidden. This separation reinforces the idea of the garden as a sacred, idealized space, separate from the messy reality of the outside world. It is the Shogun's world, and you are being allowed a glimpse of its perfection. The rocks, seemingly placed at random, are in fact locked in a carefully balanced, static harmony. It's a powerful, silent argument for the stability and permanence of the Shogun's rule. An argument written not in ink, but in stone. Let's take a walk. Not a real one, of course. Just a quiet one, in our minds. We're going to a specific place in Kyoto, to the temple of Ōnin, the temple of the peaceful dragon. This is home to perhaps the single most famous and most mysterious rock garden in the world. Even if you don't know its name, you've probably seen a picture of it. It's the ultimate expression of the Ashikaga Zen brand, so stark and so perfect that it almost feels modern, though its current from likely dates to a slightly later period of unrest. Its spirit is pure Muromachi Zen. You arrive at the temple and make your way through the grounds, leaving the noise of the city behind. You enter the main hall, the hojo, and slide open a paper screen. And there it is. A long, horizontal rectangle of pristine white gravel. It's not large, about the size of a tennis court. From this sea of sand emerge 15 stones of various sizes, arranged in 5 distinct groups. They are low, dark, ancient-looking rocks, patched with moss, like the backs of sleeping animals. The garden is enclosed on 3 sides by a low, earth-stained wall. The 4th side is the veranda where you are now sitting, on the worn wooden planks. The first thing you notice is the silence. It's not an empty silence. It's a full, humming silence. The only sound is the wind in the maple trees behind the wall. You sit, and you look, and you try to make sense of it. What does it mean? A tiger family. A constellation of islands. The peaks of mountains rising through the clouds. The genius of Ōnin is that it refuses to give you an easy answer. It is powerfully, stubbornly abstract. It simply is. It asks you not to interpret, but to experience. To let your busy mind quiet down and just be present with the rocks and the sand. And now for the most famous feature of this garden, the detail that has puzzled people for centuries. From any single vantage point on the veranda, you can only see 14 of the 15 stones. One of them is always hidden by another. To see the 15th stone, you have to move your position, which then causes another stone to disappear from view. It's a brilliant trick of composition. The only way to see all 15 stones at once is to achieve enlightenment. The garden is a physical representation of a spiritual truth. Our perception of reality is always partial, always incomplete. It's a lesson in humility, a quiet acknowledgement that we never have the full picture. This design has, of course, led to all sorts of wonderful and quirky theories. A popular one is that the number 15 represents completeness or fullness in East Asian numerology, so the inability to see all 15 stones at once is a reminder of our own human imperfection. Another, more practical theory suggests it's simply a masterful use of perspective and negative space, designed to create a sense of depth and mystery in a small, flat area. The empty space, the white gravel, becomes as important as the rocks themselves. It's the silence between notes of music that gives the melody its power. The true origin and designer of the Ōnin garden are a complete mystery, which only adds to its allure. This is a major point of contention and fun speculation among historians. There are no definitive records. Was it created by the famous painter and monk Ōnin, a major cultural figure of the time. Was it the work of an unknown, visionary monk? Some even credit a pair of lowly landscapers. One romantic legend claims the wall itself, with its unique oil stains bleeding through the clay, was the true masterpiece, and the garden was just an afterthought. We simply don't know. The garden exists without a signature, a work of anonymous genius. This anonymity actually strengthens its end message. The ego of the creator has vanished, leaving only the work itself. As you sit there on the veranda, the sun moves across the sky, and the shadows of the rocks slowly stretch and shift across the white sand. The garden is never the same from one moment to the next. It's a clock, marking the passage of time in the most silent, graceful way possible. And in this quiet space, you can feel the power of the Ashikaga brand at its most subtle. This isn't the flashy, golden power of King KKUG. This is a deeper, more confident power. It's the power to create a space that calms the mind, that inspires contemplation, that makes the messy, chaotic world of politics and war outside the walls seem distant and unimportant. It's a space that says, true power isn't about noise and spectacle. It's about stillness, order, and a deep understanding of the nature of reality. It's an advertisement so effective you don't even realize you're being sold something. You just feel at peace. While Ashikaga Yoshimitsu's golden touch defined the peak of the Shogunate's power, the brand's aesthetic would be forever shaped by another, very different leader, the 8th shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa. If Yoshimitsu was the brilliant, confident CEO basking in success, Yoshimasa was the tortured artist, the reluctant executive who would rather be in the creative studio than the boardroom. His reign is a study in contrasts, a period of immense cultural flowering set against a backdrop of political collapse and devastating warfare. Yoshimasa was a grandson of Yoshimitsu, and he inherited the shogunate at a time when its foundations were beginning to crack. He was not a natural leader. He had no taste for politics, no skill in military matters, and little interest in the tedious work of administration. His passion was for art. He was, by all accounts, a man of exquisite taste, perhaps the most refined aesthete the Ashikaga clan ever produced. For you, living in Kyoto during his time, the shogun would be a phantom-like figure, rarely seen in public, who was said to spend most of his days with poets, painters, and actors, while the country outside his palace walls began to slide into chaos. His most famous legacy, the counterpoint to his grandfather's golden pavilion, is the Jinkaku-ji, the Temple of the Silver Pavilion. This was to be his retirement villa, built on the city's eastern hills. The name is a bit of a misnomer, and it's one of history's great little ironies. Yoshimasa's original plan was to cover the pavilion in silver foil, a direct nod to his grandfather's golden masterpiece. But he never did. The silver pavilion is, and always has been, a simple, unadorned wooden structure. And here lies a wonderful little historical quirk. Why was it never covered in silver? The traditional story is that the shogunate had simply run out of money. Years of extravagance, and more importantly, the outbreak of a massive civil war, had drained the treasury. The unsilvered pavilion was a symbol of the shogunate's decline. It's a nice story, but many modern historians have a different take. They argue that the decision to leave the wood plane was a deliberate aesthetic choice. By Yoshimasa's time, tastes had shifted. The flashy gold of Yoshimitsu's era was starting to look a bit gaudy. The new ideal, heavily influenced by Zen, was one of subtlety, of finding beauty in natural materials and understated forms. The plain wood of the silver pavilion, weathered to a deep, silvery gray, was seen as more beautiful, more profound than any shiny metallic coating. It was the epitome of the wabi-sabi aesthetic. The Jinkaku-ji complex is where many of the arts we now associate with Japan were perfected under Yoshimasa's direct patronage. It had one of the first known examples of a dedicated tea room built in the rustic, 4.5 mat style that would become the standard. The architecture of the main buildings would become the prototype for the Shogun style of residential architecture, with its tatami mats, sliding paper doors, and built-in alcoves for displaying art. The Silver Pavilion was just a building. It was an incubator for a whole new way of living, one that prized quiet contemplation and refined, simple beauty. This leads to the central, tragic debate about Yoshimasa's legacy. Was he a great cultural hero or a disastrous political failure? It's a question historians love to argue. One school of thought paints him as a completely irresponsible ruler, and as they too fiddled while Kyoto burned. He poured vast sums of money into his artistic hobbies while ignoring famines and failing to prevent the outbreak of the Ōnin War, a decade-long conflict that devastated the capital and effectively destroyed the central authority of his government. In this view, his cultural achievements, while significant, cannot excuse his catastrophic political incompetence. But another, more sympathetic, view has emerged. These historians argue that Yoshimasa, recognizing he had no talent for politics, made a conscious choice to withdraw and dedicate himself to what he was good at, nurturing culture. He saw the political world collapsing around him and decided to create a sanctuary, a cultural ark where Japan's artistic traditions could be preserved and refined, safe from the chaos outside. In this interpretation, his retreat into art was an act of negligence, but a deliberate, and ultimately successful, attempt to safeguard the nation's cultural soul at a time when its political body was dying. He effectively rebranded the Shogunate one last time. Since it could no longer offer political stability, it would instead offer ultimate cultural authority. Its legacy would not be in laws and armies, but in tea bowls and garden paths. And in that, he was wildly successful. The aesthetic he championed, often called Higashiyama culture, would define the Japanese sense of beauty for centuries to come. While Yoshimasa was busy creating his cultural incubator at the Silver Pavilion, one of the key products being developed there was spreading like a new social media platform among the elite. It was the tea ceremony, or Chinowayu. For you, living in this era, the idea of tea would be undergoing a radical transformation. For centuries, tea was a drink, something consumed by monks to stay awake during long meditation sessions, or enjoyed by the upper classes in loud, boisterous tasting parties where people would gamble on guessing the origins of different exotic teas. But under the influence of the Ashikaga and their Zen advisors, it was becoming something entirely new. It was evolving from a simple beverage into a highly codified, deeply philosophical ritual. This new form of tea was the perfect social network for the Ashikaga brand. It was exclusive. It had a high barrier to entry. You had to know the complex rules, and it took place in a controlled, private environment. A powerful warlord couldn't just show up to a tea gathering with his whole army. He had to leave his swords and his rank at the door. The tea room was a neutral space where status was determined not by the number of soldiers you commanded, but by your knowledge of poetry, your appreciation for ceramics, and your ability to perform a series of simple actions with grace and magnificence. The shogun, as the ultimate host and arbiter of taste, was the super influencer of this new platform. An invitation to a tea gathering hosted by the shogun himself was the ultimate validation of your status. It meant you were in the club. Inside the small, quiet space of the tea room, the shogun could engage in subtle diplomacy, gauge the character of his powerful vassals, and build alliances, all without the formal, stiff posturing of the official audience hall. It was politics disguised as aesthetics. It was a place for a quiet conversation that could be more important than 1,000 public proclamations. And here's a fantastic little detail that shows how this social network worked. The shoguns, particularly Yoshimasa, became obsessed with collecting meibutsu, or famous objects. These were specific, named teakadis, bowls, and other utensils that had a distinguished history. They might have been owned by a famous Chinese monk or a previous shogun. These objects were the ultimate status symbols. Possessing a famous Ducati was like owning a verified blue-check account on this new social platform. The shogun would reward loyal followers not just with land, but with the gift of a Meibatsuti bowl. It was a sign of supreme favor. Conversely, he might demand that a powerful but potentially rebellious warlord hand over his prized tea collection, a way of asserting dominance without shedding any blood. The trade and ownership of these simple ceramic objects became a proxy for the high-stakes power politics of the day. The historical debate around the tea ceremony often centers on its invention. Can we really say that one person, like the famous tea master Murata Yukayo who served Yoshimasa, invented the wabi-cho style? Or was it a more gradual evolution, a slow fusion of existing practices? Some historians emphasize the role of a few key visionaries like Juko, who they credit with the revolutionary idea of combining the rustic, simple aesthetic of the common farmer with the refined, philosophical world of Zen. They see him as the Steve Jobs of tea, the one who synthesized existing technologies into a revolutionary new product. Other historians argue for a more organic development. They suggest that the principles of wabi-cha were already in the air, a natural outgrowth of the Zen-influenced culture of the time. They see Juko not as a lone inventor, but as the first person to successfully articulate and codify a trend that was already happening. He was the inventor, but the first great brand manager of wabi-cha. Whatever its exact origin, this new way of tea became a cornerstone of the Ashikaga brand's later identity. It perfectly encapsulated the values they wanted to project: taste, tranquility, and a deep, philosophical approach to life. In a world that was becoming increasingly violent and chaotic, the tea room offered a manufactured paradise. A few hours of perfect, predictable peace. It was a space where the ideal of shoguns rule, orderly, refined, and harmonious, could be performed in miniature. By mastering this new social ritual, the Ashikaga elite could demonstrate their cultural superiority, even as their real-world political power was beginning to crumble. They might be losing control of the country, but they still controlled the conversation, and that conversation was happening over a simple bowl of tea. As you step into the world of this new, refined tea ceremony, the first thing that might strike you is the equipment. It's not what you'd expect from the most powerful people in the land. The shoguns in their circle could afford the most exquisite, perfectly crafted porcelain from China, with intricate patterns and flawless glazes. And for a time, those were indeed the most prized possessions. They started to champion tea bowls that were the exact opposite: rustic, imperfect, and humble. This is the aesthetic of wabi-sabi, and it became a core component of the Ashikaga's cultural brand. Wabi speaks of a rustic simplicity, a quietness, an understated elegance. Nabi refers to the beauty that comes with age, the patina of time, the beauty of things that are weathered and imperfect. Together, they represent a profound shift in taste. Instead of a perfectly symmetrical, brightly colored Chinese bowl, the connoisseur of this new tea aesthetic would search for a humble, irregular bowl from a Korean peasant's skill nor a rough, unpretentious piece from a local Japanese potter. Imagine you're at a tea gathering in Yoshimasa's circle. The tea master presents the bowl of thick, frothy green tea to you. It's not perfectly round. The glaze is uneven, with a thick, dark drip running down one side. There might even be a small crack near the rim, repaired with gold lacquer, a technique called kintsugi, which celebrates the beauty of the repair rather than trying to hide it. Holding this bowl, you are supposed to feel a connection to something more authentic, more real, than the sterile perfection of a palace treasure. You are holding a story. You are appreciating the quiet beauty of the imperfect. This choice of aesthetics was a powerful, if subtle, piece of branding. It was a form of reverse snobbery. By rejecting the obviously expensive and technically perfect items that anyone with enough money could buy, the Ashikaga elite were creating a new, more exclusive form of status. True sophistication wasn't about showing off your wealth. It was about having the refined sensibility to see beauty where others saw none. It required education, a deep understanding of Zen principles, and a trained eye. It was a quiet way of saying, our taste is more profound than yours. We operate on a different level. And here's a wonderfully weird little detail in this world of tea ceramics, the hierarchy of bowls. At the absolute pinnacle were certain types of simple, unassuming bowls from Korea, known as Ito bowls. Legend has it they were originally humble rice bowls used by Korean peasants. Samurai brought them back to Japan, and tea masters saw in their rough, honest construction a perfect embodiment of the wabi spirit. These peasant bowls became so sought after by the highest-ranking warlords that they were worth more than a castle. A single, authenticated Ito bowl could be a prize of war or a gift that sealed a major political alliance. It's a fantastic paradox. The most powerful men in the country, fighting bloody wars over land and honor, would then meet in a quiet room and whisper, in awe about the beauty of a humble piece of pottery. This elevation of the low over the high is a source of continuous discussion among art historians and cultural critics. Was this a genuine philosophical movement, a real search for a more authentic, spiritually grounded aesthetic? Or was it the ultimate form of elite cultural appropriation? Some scholars argue that the samurai class, themselves a new elite who had displaced the old court aristocracy, were naturally drawn to an aesthetic that rejected courtly refinement. By celebrating the rustic and the masculine simplicity of peasant wares, they were celebrating their own identity. Others take a more cynical view, suggesting that it was all a game of one-upmanship. Once the wealthy merchants started being able to afford the same fancy Chinese goods as the samurai had to change the rules of the game to maintain their exclusive status. They didn't genuinely love the peasant bowls. They loved that the merchant class didn't get them. Whatever the motivation, this aesthetic choice had a profound impact. It elevated the work of anonymous craftsmen. It created a new standard of beauty that celebrated the handmade, the local, and the imperfect, and it perfectly complemented the branding of the later Ashikaga Shogunate. As their political power fractured, they doubled down on their cultural authority. They couldn't control the country, but they could dictate what constituted a beautiful tea bowl. It was a retreat into a world they could control, a world where the quiet, asymmetrical beauty of a wabi-sabi bowl offered a form of peace and order that was no longer available in the world outside the tea room door. Once you have the right mindset and the right rustic tea bowl, you need the right environment. The power of the tea ceremony as a branding tool was just in the philosophy. It was in the physical space itself. The tea room, where Jaws hits you, was a carefully engineered environment designed to transport its occupants from the messy everyday world into a temporary realm of perfect tranquility. For you, stepping into one for the first time would be a disorienting and deeply memorable experience. First, you have to get there. The tea room is often set in a garden, and you approach it via a winding path of stepping stones called a ROJI, or dewy path. The path is deliberately indirect. It forces you to slow down, to pay attention to each step. It's a physical and mental transition, designed to help you shed the concerns of the outside world. You are literally leaving the dust of the world behind. You'll pass a stone basin filled with fresh water, where you are expected to ritually rinse your hands and mouth, a symbolic act of purification. Then you arrive at the tea room itself. It's a tiny, hut-like structure, almost shockingly humble. The entrance is a small, low doorway called a Niji-Hariguchi. It's only about 3 feet high, so everyone, no matter how powerful, even the shogun himself, has to bow low and crawl through it to enter. This is a brilliant piece of psychological design. It's a great equalizer. By forcing everyone to enter in this humble, awkward posture, it strips them of their external rank and status. Inside the tea room, you are not a lord or a vassal. You are just a guest. The sword rack just outside the entrance, where you must leave your weapons, reinforces this message. This is a space of peace, no conflict. Inside, the room is small and dim. The classic tea room is just 4.5 to Tommy mats in size, barely big enough for a host and a few guests. The walls are made of natural, earthen materials. The ceiling is low, often made of woven bamboo or reeds. The light is soft, filtered through paper-covered windows. There is almost no decoration, save for a single hanging scroll and a simple flower arrangement in an alcove called the Tukonoma. The entire space is a masterpiece of minimalist design, engineered to focus your attention and calm your senses. It's the architectural equivalent of the wabi-sabi tea bowl, understated, natural, and profound. And here's a wonderfully specific and almost invisible detail. The host meticulously controls every sensory aspect of the experience. Before the guests arrive, the host will have swept the garden path, but might deliberately leave a few fallen leaves on the moss to give it a more natural, untouched feeling. Inside the tea room, the host will have burned a tiny piece of rare incense, so a faint, pleasing scent hangs in the air. The water for the tea is heated in an iron kettle, and the sound of it coming to a boil is said to resemble the sighing of wind in the pines, a sound that is considered part of the aesthetic experience. Every single detail, from the sound to the scent to the light, is curated to create a single, unified, peaceful atmosphere. The exact layout and etiquette of the tea room are, naturally, a subject of endless historical refinement and debate. For instance, the evolution of the Tukonoma alcove is a fascinating story. Was it originally a private altar in the monks' quarters? Did it evolve from the built-in desks used in early Shogun-style architecture? Historians trace its lineage through various architectural forms, and its function has shifted over time. Initially a place for religious icons, under the influence of tea masters, it became a secular space for the appreciation of art. The rules governing what could be displayed, became incredibly complex. A calligraphic scroll by a famous Zen master was considered the highest class subject, as it represented pure spirit and intellect. A colorful painting was considered less profound. These rules were constantly being debated and refined by the tea masters who served the shoguns. This meticulously controlled environment was the ultimate stage for the Ashikaga brand. The tea room was a physical manifestation of the order and harmony the shogunate claimed to represent. In this small hut, the shogun or his deputies could project an image of serene, confident, and highly refined power. The strict etiquette, the shared experience of quiet beauty, and the temporary shedding of rank all served to build a sense of community and shared identity among the ruling elite. It was a bonding ritual. By participating, you weren't just drinking tea. You were reaffirming your allegiance to a very specific cultural and political order. You were resubscribing to the brand, one silent, graceful gesture at a time. Parallel to the rise of minimalist gardens and tranquil tea rooms, another art form was being perfected as a core element of the Ashikaga Zen brand, monochrome ink wash painting, known as suiboku ga or sumii. If you were to walk into the residence of a high-ranking samurai or a Zen temple in Kyoto, you wouldn't see walls covered in bright, colorful paintings. Instead, you'd see hanging scrolls and folding screens decorated with dramatic, moody landscapes painted in nothing but black ink on white paper or silk. It was an art of suggestion, not statement. This style was imported from China, where it had been the preferred medium of scholar artists for centuries. But under the patronage of the Ashikaga shoguns and the guidance of their Zen monk artists, it was adapted and refined into a distinctly Japanese form. The choice of black ink was, itself, a philosophical statement. Like the rock garden, it was a deliberate rejection of the colorful, decorative style of painting Yamato we associated with the old imperial court. This wasn't art meant to be merely pretty. This was art meant to be a spiritual exercise. The technique itself was demanding, a direct reflection of Zen principles. The artist would grind his own ink stick on a stone slab, mixing it with water to create a whole spectrum of tones, from the palest, most watery gray to the deepest, richest black. There was no room for error. Every brushstroke was final. You couldn't paint over a mistake. This required immense concentration, discipline, and a confident, decisive hand. A single, energetic stroke might represent a bamboo stalk, its varying thickness and tone suggesting the plant's form and vitality. A splash of wet ink, a flung ink technique called haboku, could miraculously resolve into a misty mountain landscape. The act of painting was a form of meditation, and the finished work was seen as a direct record of the artist's state of mind at that moment. The subjects were classics and themes. You would see vast, empty landscapes where tiny human figures, a lone fisherman in a boat, a scholar walking to a remote hut, were dwarfed by the majesty of nature. This reinforced the idea of humanity as small place in the cosmos. You'd see portraits of famous and eccentrics and patriarchs, their faces captured with a few quick, calligraphic lines that seemed to reveal their inner spirit. Then you'd see endless paintings of the four gentlemen: bamboo, orchid, plum blossom, and chrysanthemum. Each plant represented a Confucian or Zen virtue. Bamboo for its flexibility and resilience, the orchid for its humble elegance, and so on. And here's a beautiful niche detail for you. The paper or silk on which the painting was done was just as important as the ink. Artists cherished aged, specially prepared paper that would absorb the ink in just the right way, allowing for subtle blurring and bleeding effects that were impossible on new paper. The negative space, the unpainted white of the paper, was not empty background. It was an active element of the composition. It was the mist, the sky, the water, the vastness of the void. This concept of active, meaningful emptiness is central to Zen aesthetics. The authenticity and ranking of these ink paintings became a major preoccupation for the Ashikaga elite, leading to a point of scholarly contention. The shoguns, especially Yoshimasa, appointed official curators from the ranks of artist monks, known as the dobos who, these men, like Nomi, Jiome, and Soami of father, son, and grandson trio, were the ultimate arbiters of taste. They catalogued the shogun's vast collection, advised him on new acquisitions, and authenticated works. The problem is, they also ran large ateliers of their own, producing paintings in the style of the Chinese masters. This has led to centuries of debate for art historians. Is that famous landscape attributed to the Chinese master Muki actually a 13th century Chinese original? Or is it a brilliant 15th century Japanese copy or work in the style of created in Soami's workshop for the shogun? The lines between curating, copying, and creating were incredibly blurry, making attribution a thrilling, and sometimes impossible, detective game. This art form was the perfect visual language for the Shogunate as brand. It was serious, sophisticated, and deeply philosophical. It was easily accessible. It required the viewer to participate, to fill in the gaps, to understand the symbolism. Like the rock gardens and the tea ceremony, it was another way for the elite to distinguish themselves. To Ōnin correctly display a Suiboku-ga scroll by a famous master was to signal your membership in the cultural inner circle. It was a visual shorthand that said, "We are not just warriors. We are men of profound understanding." It was branding at its most subtle and atmospheric, a story told in shades of black and white. As you immerse yourself in this world of Zen-inspired aesthetics, in the stark gardens, the minimalist tea rooms, and the monochrome paintings, you start to notice something that isn't there. Emptiness, negative space, silence. This isn't just an accident. It's a deliberate and powerful design choice. This concept is a name in Japanese aesthetics, Ma. And understanding Ma is the key to understanding the soul of the Ashikaga brand. Ma doesn't just mean empty space in the way we might think of it. It's not a void. It's a pregnant pause, an interval full of energy and potential. It's the silence between the notes that creates the rhythm of a piece of music. It's the unpainted white silk in a sumi painting that gives form to the mountains and the mist. It's the space between the rocks in a Zen garden that defines their relationship to each other. For you, experiencing this culture, Ma would be the quiet hum beneath the surface of everything, the space that gives everything else its meaning. In the architecture of the time, Ma is fundamental. Think of the interior of a shogun's reception hall or a tea room. Unlike a cluttered European castle, the space is largely empty. There is no heavy furniture. The room is defined by its flexible, open spaces, separated by sliding paper screens fusuma that can be opened up to create one large area or closed to create smaller, more intimate ones. The room is not a fixed container, but a fluid space that can be reconfigured depending on the occasion. The emptiness is the room's greatest feature. It's what gives it its versatility and sense of calm spaciences. This principle extends directly from the visual to the experiential. In the tea ceremony, the moments of silence, when the host is wiping the bowl, when the guests are simply contemplating the flower arrangement, are as important as the moments of action. The pauses are not awkward. They are an integral part of the ritual, a shared space of quiet contemplation. Similarly, in a conversation with a Zen master, the pauses in his speech are not signs of hesitation. They are invitations for you to think, to let the meaning of his words sink in. Ma is the space you need for insight to arise. And here's a wonderfully subtle detail about how Ma was incorporated into daily life. Look at the way a single flower arrangement, Raikibana, is displayed in the two-kono-ma alcove. The goal is not to create a dense, colorful bouquet. The goal is to use as few stems and leaves as possible to create a living sculpture. The arrangement is not just about the flowers and branches. It's about the empty space around them and between them. The lines of the branches create and define this negative space, making it an active part of the composition. A master of Ikebana is a master of sculpting emptiness. It's a perfect, small-scale demonstration of the power of Ma. The philosophical origins of Ma are a subject of deep scholarly discussion. While it's often associated with Zen Buddhism, its roots are much older and more complex. It's connected to ancient Taoist ideas about the utility of the void, the usefulness of the useless, as in the empty space inside a bowl being what makes it useful. It also has roots in native Japanese Shinto beliefs, which emphasize the purity of empty spaces as suitable dwellings for the gods kami. Historians and philosophers debate the relative influence of these different streams of thought. Is the Ma in a Zen garden a purely Buddhist concept of emptiness sunyata, or is it a continuation of an ancient, pre-Buddhist Japanese sensitivity to space and place? The most likely answer is that Zen provided a new, sophisticated philosophical language for an aesthetic preference that was already deeply embedded in the culture. This embrace of Ma was a brilliant, if unconscious, branding move. It created an aesthetic that was the polar opposite of the busy, decorative, and often chaotic art of other cultures. It projected an image of calm, centered, and profound confidence. A government that champions emptiness is a government that is not afraid of silence, that does not need to constantly shout about its own power. It suggests a deep inner strength. It implies that the shogun's authority is so self-evident that it doesn't need to be buttressed by constant ornamentation. The most powerful statement can be a quiet one. By making emptiness a core part of its brand identity, the Ashikaga Shogunate created an aesthetic of power that was all the more effective for its subtlety and silence. Now, let's leave the quiet contemplation of the garden and tea room and head to the theater. But this isn't a theater of flashy spectacle and thrilling action. The Ashikaga Shogunate, in its quest to sponsor a culture that reflected its brand values, championed a new form of performance art that was as disciplined, symbolic, and demanding as a Zen garden. No theater. For you, attending an old play for the first time would be a strange, hypnotic, and utterly unforgettable experience. The first thing you do notice is the stage. It's simple, open platform made of polished cypress wood, with a roof held up by four pillars. There is no curtain and virtually no set, aside from a single pine tree painted on the back wall. The simplicity is intentional. Like the rock garden, the stage is a sacred, abstract space where the imagination of the audience is expected to do most of the work. A simple bamboo frame might represent a boat, a palace, or a mountain. The story unfolds not through elaborate scenery, but through poetry, music, and movement. Then the performers enter. They move with an unnatural slowness. Every single gesture is stylized and deliberate, from the way they walk to the way they turn their head. The main actor, the shite, often wears a mask and is dressed in magnificent, multi-layered silk robes. The pace is glacial. A single journey from one side of the stage to the other could take several minutes, representing a journey of hundreds of miles. It's an art form that completely warps your sense of time. You're not watching a realistic depiction of events, you're watching a ritual unfold. The stories are drawn from classic literature, historical chronicles, and myths. They often revolve around a wandering monk who encounters the ghost of a famous warrior or a tormented court lady at a place of great historical significance. The first act is usually slow and mysterious, as the monk talks to a local person, the ghost in disguise. In the second act, the ghost reveals their true form and reenacts the moment of passion, grief, or violence that has trapped them in this world, seeking release through the monk's prayers. The themes are deeply Buddhist: the impermanence of life, the suffering caused by attachment, and the possibility of salvation. And here's a fantastic little detail that shows the deep connection between No and the Shogunate's elite warrior culture. The art form was perfected by a father-son duo, Konkami and Shiami, under the direct patronage of the Golden Shogun himself, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu. The story goes that Yoshimitsu, then a teenager, attended a performance and was so captivated by the beauty and talent of the young Shiami that he took the troupe under his wing, effectively making them part of his court. He gave them a samurai surname, elevated their social status, and provided the resources for them to refine their art. Shiami, in turn, became not just a brilliant actor and playwright, but also a profound theorist, writing secret treatises on the art of No that are still studied today. No was just entertainment for the shogun. It was a personal project. The aesthetic principles Shiami laid out in his writings are a point of deep scholarly fascination. He developed the concept of yugen, one of the most important and difficult to translate terms in Japanese aesthetics. Yugen refers to a profound, mysterious grace, a sense of a deeper, unseen world hinted at through the performance. It's not about what is shown, but what is suggested. It's the feeling you get when you see the sun sink behind a flower-clad hill, or watch a wild goose disappear into the clouds. Zayama's genius was in figuring out how to create this feeling on a bare wooden stage. Historians and literary critics still debate the precise meaning of yugen and how it relates to Zen philosophy. Is it a purely aesthetic concept, or does it have a specific spiritual or metaphysical dimension? Zayama's own writings are poetic and elusive, leaving the question tantalizingly open. By sponsoring No, the Ashikaga were doing something very clever. They were taking a popular, somewhat rustic form of entertainment and elevating it into a high art form that reflected their core brand values. No was disciplined. It was deeply philosophical. It was steeped in history and literature. And, crucially, it was difficult. To truly appreciate a No play, you needed to know the stories, understand the symbolism, and have the patience for its slow, deliberate pace. It was another cultural shibboleth, a way to separate the refined elite from the common masses. Attending a No performance at the Shogun's palace was not just a night out. It was a statement of your cultural and political allegiance. It was another quiet, beautiful, and deeply serious pillar of the Ashikaga brand. As you sit watching the slow, deliberate dance of the No actor, Your eyes are drawn to his face, or rather, his lack of a face. He is wearing a mask. The no mask, or Ōnin, is the soul of the performance. A small, carved piece of cypress wood that is one of the most powerful and haunting elements of the Ashikaga brand's theatrical wing. These weren't just props. They were considered sacred objects, works of art imbued with their own spirit. The masks are small, often smaller than the actor's actual face. They cover only the front of the face, held in place with a cord. From the audience, this creates a strange, otherworldly effect. The mask is a still point in a world of flowing silk and measured movement. It depicts a single, concentrated emotion, the serene beauty of a young woman, the fierce jealousy of a demon, the sorrowful dignity of an old man. There are dozens of types of masks, each with its own name and specific use. An experienced audience member would instantly recognize the mask of the Hanie, with its sharp horns and leering mouth, as a woman consumed by demonic jealousy, or the Komoji mask as the ideal of youthful, innocent female beauty. The genius of the no mask lies in its neutrality. While it depicts a single, dominant emotion, a skilled actor can make it express a whole range of feelings through subtle changes in posture. This is a key technique called terasu to shine and kum or asu to cloud. If the actor tilts the mask slightly upwards, it catches the light and appears to be smiling or laughing. If he tilts it slightly downwards, shadows fall across its features, and it appears to be weeping or lost in sorrow. The mask itself is unchanging, but its expression is alive, shifting with the actor's movements on the audience's perception. It's a magical, minimalist effect. The emotion isn't on the mask. It's in the space between the mask and the viewer. And here's a fantastic, slightly spooky detail about the actor's relationship with the mask. Before going on stage, the actor will sit alone in front of a mirror in a room called the Kagami no Mamiro room. He will hold the mask, study it, and in a sense, grade it. He is not just putting on a costume. He is undertaking a transformation, subsuming his own identity into the spirit of the mask. The great No masters wrote that the actor must become the mask. It is a process of emptying the self, a very Zen-like discipline, that allows the spirit of the character, the ghost, the demon, the god, to manifest through the actor's body. Some actors even spoke of the masks having a will of their own. The spiritual and psychological function of the mask in No is a subject of endless fascination and debate among performance theorists and historians. Are the masks simply brilliant theatrical devices, tools for characterization and emotional projection? Or do they function on a deeper, more shamanistic level? Some scholars argue that No has its roots in ancient folk religious rituals, where a masked performer would act as a temporary vessel for God or a spirit. In this view, the No actor is not just an actor, but a kind of medium, and the mask is the conduit that allows the spirit world to break through into the world of the living for a few hours on a wooden stage. Others argue for a more secular interpretation, seeing the mask as a sophisticated tool for aesthetic distancing, forcing the audience to focus on the poetry and the movement, rather than on a specific actor's realistic facial expressions. The themes of the plays, so often centered on ghosts and possession, reinforce this spiritual dimension. The world of No is one where the past is never truly past. The spirits of the dead are all around us, tied to the earth by their powerful, unresolved emotions, love, hate, regret, and the desire for revenge. These were themes that resonated deeply with the samurai elite, whose lives were defined by violence, loyalty, and the constant presence of death. The plays offered a kind of cultural therapy, a way to process the spiritual anxieties of their time. The tormented ghost of a defeated warrior, reenacting his final battle on stage, was not just a character in a play. He was a reflection of their own world, a world full of angry and unmourned spirits. By watching the ghost finally find peace through the prayers of the monk, The audience could experience a sense of catharsis and a reaffirmation of the Buddhist order that underpinned the shogun's rule. The mask was the face of this other world, a beautiful, terrifying, and unforgettable icon of the Ashikaga-esque complex cultural brand. Let's step out of the theater and back into the streets of Kyoto, to the very heart of the Ashikaga-esque power, the shogun's own residence. We've talked about its location and grandeur, but the design of these mansions itself was a key part of the branding effort. A shogun's palace was just a home. It was a carefully designed stage set for the performance of power, and it had to project two, seemingly contradictory, messages at once. I am an invincible military commander, and I am a man of supreme cultural refinement. The architecture was a fusion of fortress and art gallery. From the outside, the first thing you'd notice would be the defensive features. The entire complex would be surrounded by moats and high, sturdy walls. The gates would be massive, reinforced structures, manned by elite guards. These were not the elegant, open-plan villas of the peaceful court aristocracy. These were military compounds, planted right in the middle of the capital. It was a constant, physical reminder of where the real power lay. The shogun's brand was, at its core, based on military might, and the architecture made that clear from the very first impression. But once you pass through those intimidating gates, the atmosphere changes. You enter a world of sprawling gardens, elegant pavilions, and airy, open-plan buildings. This is where the second part of the brand message comes in. The style of architecture that was perfected in these residences is known as Shonzi-yukori, and it would become the basis for traditional Japanese residential architecture for centuries. If you have an image in your head of a classic Japanese house, with tatami mat floors, sliding paper doors, shoji and fusuma, and large, open rooms, you are thinking of the Shon style. This style was perfect for the shogun's needs. The use of sliding partitions meant that spaces could be easily reconfigured. A series of small rooms could be instantly transformed into one massive reception hall for a banquet or a major announcement. This flexibility was ideal for a ruler who had to entertain everyone from a small group of intimate advisors to a massive gathering of provincial warlords. The design was also integrated with the outside. The wide verandas and sliding outer walls blurred the line between the house and the garden, allowing the beauty of the landscape to become part of the interior space. And here's a fantastic little detail that was a key innovation of the Shon style. The two konoma alcove and its companions, the kaige dane staggered shelves, and the tsuk shown a built-in desk or window alcove. We saw the two konoma in the tea room, but in the shogun's main reception hall. It became the focal point of the entire room. This was the designated spot for displaying the shogun's most prized art possessions, the perfect ink painting, the exquisite flower arrangement, the priceless Chinese ceramic. When a guest was formally received by the shogun, they would be seated in the place of honor, right in front of this display. It was an unsubtle way of overwhelming them with the shogun's wealth and, more importantly, his impeccable taste. It was an art gallery and an audience hall rolled into one. The development of this architectural style is a fascinating topic for historians. Was the Shon style a natural evolution of earlier forms of domestic architecture? Or was it a more revolutionary development, directly inspired by the layout of Zen monastery study halls? The name itself, Shon, refers to a study or library, and many of its key features, the built-in desk, the shelves, the square pillars, bear a strong resemblance to the rooms where Zen monks would read and copy sutras. Some historians argue that the Ashikaga elite, so deeply enmeshed with the Zen world, essentially adapted the functional, scholarly architecture of the monasteries for their own residential use, creating a new high-status living space. Others see a more gradual blending of warrior, aristocratic, and monastic styles that coalesced into the Shon from over time. Regardless of its origins, the shogun's residence was a masterclass in brand messaging. It was a physical space that perfectly embodied the dual identity the Ashikaga wanted to project. The outer walls said warrior, while the inner spaces whispered aesthete. It was a place where a general could plan a military campaign in one room, while a poetry contest was being held in the next. This fusion of the martial bu and the literary bun was the ideal of the samurai ruler, and the shogun's palace was its ultimate architectural expression. It was a constant, lived-in advertisement for a brand of power that was both strong and sophisticated, a brand that claimed to have mastered both the art of war and the art of living. So the Ashikaga Shogunate is running this incredibly sophisticated, multi-platform marketing campaign. They have their minimalist gardens, their exclusive tea clubs, their soulful theater, and their high-concept art. But what about the competition? How did the other powerful warlords, the daimyo, react to this branding blitz from the capital? You, as a neutral observer, would see a fascinating range of responses, from eager imitation to outright scorn. The market was not uniform. The first and most common reaction, especially from the powerful Shugo daimyo provincial governors who spent a lot of time in Kyoto, was to copy the shogun. They were the primary audience for this campaign, and for many, it worked perfectly. To be seen as a serious player, you had to speak the language of culture that the shogun was promoting. So these powerful warlords started building their own villas in Kyoto, hiring their own zen advisors, hosting their own tea gatherings, and collecting their own expensive, rustic tea bowls. It created a kind of cultural arms race. Imagine being a powerful but uncultured lord from a remote province, visiting the capital for the first time. You get invited to a poetry party at a rival's mansion. You're surrounded by men in elegant robes, whispering about the subtle beauty of a Chinese ink painting you can't make head or tail of. You would feel hopelessly out of your depth. Your military power wouldn't count for much in that room. To gain influence and respect in the capital, you had to learn the new rules. You had to buy into the brand. This was a brilliant form of soft power. The shogun was controlling his most powerful vassals not just with laws and armies, but with aesthetics. However, not everyone was impressed. Many of the more rugged, provincial warlords, especially those who rarely came to Kyoto, viewed the shogun and his circle as decadent and soft. They saw all this focus on poetry, tea, and rock gardens as a dangerous distraction from the real business of a samurai, warfare. To them, the Ashikaga brand looked less like sophisticated and enlightened and more like weak and effeminate. They would have muttered that while the shogun was busy composing couplets, his control over the provinces was slipping. And they weren't entirely wrong. Here's a fantastic little detail that illustrates this cultural divide. While the Kyoto elite were obsessing over the quiet, minimalist art of sumi, many provincial warrior clans continued to favor a completely different style. Big, bold, colorful paintings full of action. They would commission large folding screens depicting famous battles, like the Tales of the Hike, with scenes of charging samurai, clashing armies, and dramatic last stands. This was a brand of power that was simple, direct, and unapologetically militaristic. It wasn't about subtle suggestions of inner peace. It was about celebrating glorious victories and martial prowess. It was the aesthetic equivalent of a loud, bombastic action movie versus a quiet, black and white art film. This tension between the central Ashikaga brand and the local tastes of provincial warriors is a rich area for historical analysis. Did the spread of Kyoto culture to the provinces represent a successful civilizing mission by the shogunate, a true victory for their brand? Or was it a superficial adoption of trends by local lords who were, in reality, growing more and more independent? Some historians argue that when provincial daimyo built their own little Kyoto-esque in their home domains, complete with gardens and tea rooms, it was a sign of their submission to the shogun's cultural authority. But others argue it was the exact opposite. It was a declaration of independence. It was the local lord saying, "I don't need to go to the capital for culture anymore. I am so powerful that I can replicate it right here, on my own terms, I am the center of my own world. This dynamic shows that even the most well-crafted brand message can be interpreted in different ways by different audiences. For some, the Ashikaga Zen-infused culture was an aspirational model to be emulated. It represented the pinnacle of civilization. For others, it was a sign of decay, a warning that the warrior government had lost its way. And for a shrewd few, it was simply a toolkit of status symbols to be adopted and adapted for their own purposes, a way to build their own local brands of power in preparation for the day when the central government would collapse entirely. The Shogun might have been the biggest brand on the market, but powerful regional competitors were emerging, and they were learning to use the master's own marketing tools against him. You can feel the tension building. The Shogun is focused on perfecting the national brand identity through culture, but the regional franchise managers, the powerful daimyo, are getting restless. The sophisticated, tranquil world of tea rooms and rock gardens is about to be shattered by the brutal reality of politics. The carefully constructed brand image of Ashikaga stability is about to run head first into a brick wall. That wall was the Ōnin War. This was a conflict that started not in some distant province, but right in the heart of Kyoto. It was a noble war of ideology. It was a messy, drawn-out succession dispute within the Ashikaga clan itself, which spiraled into a nationwide conflict. A friend, the art-loving Shogun Yoshimasa, had no son for many years, so he designated his younger brother, Amon, to be his heir. But then, unexpectedly, Yoshimasa's wife gave birth to a son. Now there were two heirs. The Shogun's wife, a formidable political player, backed her infant son. The Shogun's brother had no intention of stepping aside. This internal family squabble was the spark. The two most powerful warlord families in the country, the Yamana and the Hosokawa, who were already bitter rivals, saw their chance. The Yamana backed the baby son. The Hosokawa backed the brother. They called on their allies from all over Japan, and soon, hundreds of thousands of samurai poured into Kyoto. The city, the beautiful stage for the Ashikaga's cultural performance, became the battlefield. For you, a resident of Kyoto, this would have been an absolute nightmare. The war raged for over a decade, from 1467 to 1477. It was a war of decisive battles, but a grinding, street-by-street urban warfare. Armies built fortified camps in different parts of the city. Temples and palaces were turned into fortresses. Arson was a common tactic. Entire districts of the city were burned to the ground, not once, but multiple times, to deny the enemy cover. The Golden Pavilion, miraculously, survived, but the Shogun's own Palace of Flowers was destroyed. The great Zen temples, the centers of learning and art, were looted and burned. The city that had been the pride of the Ashikaga brand was reduced to a smoldering ruin. Here's a devastatingly specific detail that captures the horror. The destruction was so total that the very layout of the city was changed forever. The northern half of Kyoto, which had been the aristocratic and governmental heart of the city, was so thoroughly annihilated that it was essentially abandoned, turning into fields and farmland for over a century. The city physically shrank, its population fleeing in terror. The name Kyoto itself was almost lost. For a time, people just referred to the surviving southern commercial district. The capital of peace and refinement had become a war-torn wasteland. The Ōnin War is a major turning point, and historians still debate its ultimate cause and significance. Was it simply the result of a weak shogun and a petty family squabble? Or was it the inevitable explosion of deeper, structural problems that had been building for decades? Some historians emphasize the personal failures of Yoshimasa and the ambitions of the rival warlords. They see it as a tragic, but avoidable, political meltdown. But a more structural view argues that the war was the logical outcome of the Ashikaga system itself. The Shogunate had never truly centralized power. It had always relied on a precarious balance between the major warlord families. Once that balance was upset by the succession crisis, the entire system was bound to collapse. The war was the cause of the shogunate's weakness. It was the ultimate symptom of it. The war was a public relations catastrophe from which the Ashikaga brand never recovered. How could the shogun claim to be the great arbiter of harmony and order when his own capital was a bloody battlefield, torn apart by his own vassals fighting over his own family's succession? The brand promise was stability and refinement. The reality was chaos and destruction. The meticulously crafted image, built over generations with rock gardens, tea bowls, and no plays, was incinerated along with the city's wooden temples. The shogun was revealed to be not a master puppeteer, but a helpless spectator at his own government's implosion. The central authority of the Ashikaga shogunate was effectively over. They knew far more violent and chaotic era was about to begin. The Ōnin war finally sputtered to a close after a decade, not with a decisive victory, but because both sides were exhausted and their armies just sort of melted away. Kyoto was a ruin, the shogun's authority was a joke, and the country spiraled into a century of constant, decentralized warfare known as the Sengokuji Day, the age of the country at war. You would think that in such a violent and chaotic time, the sophisticated, subtle culture nurtured by the Ashikaga would vanish. But something strange and wonderful happened. The art didn't die. It escaped. With the central patron, the shogun, now broken powerless, the creatives, the Zen monks, the no actors, the painters, the garden designers, the tea masters, had to find new work. They scattered from the ruined capital and sought patronage from the newly powerful provincial daimyo. These were the very warlords who are now carving out their own independent kingdoms, fighting each other for supremacy. And paradoxically, these ruthless military men were eager to hire the cultural refugees from Kyoto. This is a key dynamic of the Sengoku period. The political center had collapsed, but the cultural brand created by the Ashikaga was now being disseminated throughout the country. A powerful warlord who had just conquered a new province would celebrate not just by building a bigger castle, but by inviting a famous tea master to his court or commissioning a Zen monk to design him a rock garden. It became a way for these new lords to legitimize their rule. By adopting the high culture of the old capital, they were signaling that they were not just brutish thugs, but worthy successors to the old order. They were, in effect, stealing the Ashikaga-esque cultural branding and applying it to their own new companies. You can see this happening all over the country. Great cultural centers popped up in the castle towns of powerful daimyo, like the Uchi in Yamaguchi or the Imagawa in Sampyu. These cities became known as Little Kyoto-s, bustling with exiled court nobles and artists. The famous ink painter Sessue Tojo, one of the greatest artists Japan has ever produced, did much of his most important work not for the shogun in Kyoto, but for the Uchi clan in the far west of Japan. The art had followed the power. And here's a fantastic little detail that shows just how this cultural diffusion worked on the ground level. The tea ceremony, in particular, flourished in this chaotic era, especially among the rising class of wealthy merchants in port cities like Saki. These merchants, who were becoming incredibly powerful through trade, couldn't compete with the samurai in terms of military might or noble lineage, but they could compete, and often surpass them, in the realm of culture and wealth. They became some of the most avid practitioners and patrons of the tea ceremony, collecting priceless utensils and hiring the most famous tea masters. The tea room became a space where a wealthy merchant and a powerful warlord could meet on something approaching equal terms. It was a new kind of social ladder, and the rungs were made of pottery. This flourishing in chaos presents a fascinating paradox for historians to ponder. Why did a period of such intense violence and political fragmentation produce such an extraordinary cultural blossoming? One theory is that the very chaos of the age created a desperate need for the order, tranquility, and sense of meaning that these arts provided. The tea room was an escape, a sanctuary of peace in a world of war. Another theory points to the intense competition among the daimyo. In a world where everyone was a potential rival, cultural superiority became another weapon in your arsenal, a way to attract talented followers and project an aura of success. Finally, some historians argue that the collapse of the central Ashikaga authority was actually liberating for the arts. Artists were no longer tied to the single, rigid taste of the shogunate court and could experiment and find patronage from a wide variety of sources. So as you travel through this war-torn country, you see a strange and beautiful contradiction. You see castles being built and burned, armies marching, and villages pillaged. But you also see a merchant carefully examining a tea bowl, a warlord listening to an old performance, and a monk raking patterns in a noose and garden. The political body of the Ashikaga Shogunate was dead, but its cultural soul had broken free from the confines of Kyoto and was now putting down new roots all across the fractured landscape of Japan. The brand had outlived the company. The Ashikaga Shoguns would continue to exist as figureheads in Kyoto for almost another century after the Ōnin War. But they were ghosts. The real power was now in the hands of the Sengoku daimyo, the new CEOs who were fighting to consolidate the fractured market into a new, unified enterprise. And as these new titans of the age rose to power, one after another, you can see them deliberately reaching back and picking up the pieces of the old Ashikaga brand, reusing its most powerful elements for their own purposes. The brand was just too valuable to let die. The first of the great unifiers, Oda Nobunaga, was a brutal and pragmatic revolutionary who shattered the old Buddhist power structures. You wouldn't think of him as a man of refined taste. Yet, Nobunaga was an avid and ruthless practitioner of what was called Meibutsugari, or famous subject hunting. He understood the political power encoded in tea utensils. He forced powerful rivals to hand over their prized tea caddies as a sign of submission and rewarded his most loyal generals with the gift of a famous tea bowl. He was using the Ashikaga as cultural playbook, but in a much more aggressive and transparently political way. He was just hosting tea parties. He was weaponizing them. After Nobunaga's assassination, his top general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, took over. Hideyoshi was a man of peasant origins, and he was acutely aware of his lack of noble lineage. To compensate, he embraced the Ashikaga cultural brand with the fervor of a convert, but he magnified it to an almost cartoonish degree. He built a portable, golden tea room that he could take with him on military campaigns, a bizarre fusion of Yoshimitsu's golden splendor and Yoshimasa's tea culture. He hosted a legendary, massive outdoor tea party at Gitano, inviting thousands of people from all social classes. It was a brilliant piece of populist political theater, taking the exclusive elite ritual of the Ashikaga and turning it into a grand public spectacle to celebrate his own power. Finally, the man who would truly finish the job and establish a lasting peace, Takugoji Ieyasu, was the most conservative of the three. He deliberately modeled his new shogunate on the old systems. While he moved the political capital to his fortress city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, he left the emperor in the cultural heart of the nation in Kyoto. He understood the importance of separating the martial and the aesthetic, and his new government continued to patronize the arts that the Ashikaga had championed. The tea ceremony became an essential skill for any ambitious samurai in the new Tokugawa regime. No theater was formalized as the official ceremonial art of the warrior class. The Ashikaga brand's core elements were now fully integrated into the operating system of the new government. And here's a wonderfully ironic little fact. The architectural style perfected in the Ashikaga shoguns' residences, the Shonzi-yukori, became the template for the palaces of the Tokugawa shoguns and the mansions of their daimyo. The Ninomaru Palace at Nijo Castle in Kyoto, built by the Tokugawa shoguns, is one of the greatest surviving examples of this style. So centuries after the Ashikaga had lost all power, their successors were still living and holding court in spaces that were direct architectural descendants of the Ashikaga vision. They were, quite literally, living inside the old brand's packaging. The question of how and why this cultural inheritance occurred is a key topic for historians of this period. Was it a conscious and cynical adoption of a successful political toolkit? Or was it a more organic process, a genuine appreciation for a cultural tradition that had, by this point, become deeply ingrained in the warrior class identity? Some historians argue that for rulers like Hideyoshi, it was pure image-making, a desperate attempt to cloak his raw ambition in a veneer of traditional legitimacy. Others contend that these men, as products of their time, truly believed in the aesthetic and philosophical values of the tea ceremony and Zen arts. They weren't just using the culture, they were part of it. The most likely truth is that it was both. They recognized the political utility of the brand, but they also had a genuine, personal connection to its content. What is certain is that the cultural DNA of the Ashikaga period proved to be incredibly resilient. The political structure they built was fragile and fell apart, but the brand they created, the fusion of Zen philosophy with warrior culture, expressed through gardens, tea, ink painting, and theater, was so powerful and so perfectly suited to the Japanese elite that it was adapted, and preserved by the very men who replaced them. The company went bankrupt, but the brand became a national treasure. So after this long journey through golden pavilions and silent rock gardens, we have to ask the big question: was the Ashikaga's massive branding campaign ultimately a success? It's the kind of question that makes for a great final exam in a history class, because there's no easy answer. It depends entirely on how you define success. If you look at it from a purely political and military standpoint, the answer has to be a resounding no. It was a failure. The primary goal of any government is to maintain peace, order, and its own power. The Ashikaga Shogunate failed spectacularly on all three counts. Their reign was born in civil war, plagued by it for decades, and ultimately disintegrated into the century-long chaos of the Sengoku period. The sophisticated culture they nurtured in Kyoto did little to stop their most powerful vassals from tearing the country, and the capital, to shreds. You could argue that their obsession with aesthetics was a fatal distraction. While they were perfecting the art of the tea ceremony, their political house was burning down. The brand was beautiful, but the company's fundamentals were rotten. But if you shift your perspective and look at it as a long-term cultural project, the picture changes completely. From this angle, the campaign was one of the most stunning successes in history. The aesthetic and philosophical brand identity that the Ashikaga sponsored and created didn't just define their era. It went on to define how Japan itself is often perceived, both by the Japanese and by the outside world. When you think of the classic Japanese aesthetic, minimalism, tranquility, a deep appreciation for nature, the beauty of imperfection, you are thinking, in large part, of the brand that was born in the Ashikaga court. Think about it. The Rock Garden at Ohio and G is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by millions. The tea ceremony is practiced worldwide as a path to mindfulness. The term Zen has entered the global vocabulary as a synonym for common focus. The aesthetics of wabi-sabi and ma have influenced countless modern artists, designers, and architects, from the furniture of Charles Andre Eames to the minimalist ethos of Apple. The cultural software developed during the Muromachi period is still running on the world's hardware today. That is an incredible, enduring legacy. Here's a small but telling modern detail. In the 1980 seconds and 90 seconds and 90 seconds, when Japanese corporations were at the peak of their global power, many of them consciously used Zen and samurai imagery in their international branding. They would talk about corporate philosophy in terms of discipline, harmony, and long-term vision, often invoking the spirit of the samurai. They were, in a sense, running the same playbook as the Ashikaga, using a culturally specific brand of refined power to legitimize their position on the world stage. It shows just how deep and persistent these cultural codes are. This dual legacy, political failure versus cultural triumph, is the central paradox that historians of the Muromachi period grapple with. Did the cultural success happen because of the political failure, or in spite of it? One school of thought, as we've discussed, argues that the two are linked. The political weakness of the later shoguns forced them to double down on their cultural authority as their only remaining source of prestige. It was a kind of magnificent, beautiful compensation for their real-world impotence. Another perspective suggests that the political chaos was actually a catalyst. The breakdown of central authority allowed culture to spread out of the hothouse of Kyoto and cross-pollinate with regional traditions, resulting in a more diverse and resilient artistic landscape. The brand thrived because it was decentralized. So, as we look back on the Ashikaga Shogunate, we see a government that couldn't keep the peace or control its own territory, but which managed to create a brand of such profound beauty and power that it has outlasted countless empires. They lost the political battle of their own time, but they won the cultural war for centuries to come. Was it a good trade? It's impossible to say, but it serves as a powerful reminder that history is not just a story of kings and battles. It is also a story of the quiet, persistent tower of ideas, of the way a simple tea bowl or a garden of stones can shape the soul of a nation long after the swords have rusted and the castles have turned to dust. And so, our journey ends where it began, in a quiet garden. The sun is low, casting long, soft shadows across the raked sand. The world of politics, of betrayal and war, of Ashikaga Takayuji's ambition and Doshimasa's retreat, feels very far away. All that's left is the stillness. The rocks, ancient and silent, seem to absorb the last light of day. They were here long before the shoguns, and they remain long after. They are the ultimate survivors. The cultural brand the Ashikaga worked so hard to build is no longer a tool of statecraft. It's no longer an advertisement for a shaky military government. It has been stripped of its original political purpose. What remains is the art itself, in its purest form. When you visit King Takayuji today, you're not thinking about Yoshimitsu's diplomatic maneuvering with Ming China. You're just struck by the breathtaking, almost impossible beauty of a golden building reflected in a pond. The political message has faded, but the aesthetic power is as strong as ever. When you sit on the veranda at Ōnin, you are not contemplating the decline of the shogun's authority. You are contemplating your own mind. The garden has become a mirror. The questions it poses are no longer about who has the right to rule Japan. They are about the nature of perception, the meaning of emptiness, the search for peace in your own heart. The brand has been universalized. It's no longer selling the legitimacy of the Ashikaga clan. It's offering a moment of tranquility to anyone who is willing to sit and be quiet for a while. And here's one last, lovely detail that brings it all full circle. Many of the great Zen temples in Kyoto, the very ones that served as the creative agencies for the Ashikaga brand, are still active monasteries today. Monks still rise before dawn to chant sutras. They still practice walking meditation in the gardens. They still maintain the raked sand, creating those perfect, calming patterns day after day. The culture is not just a museum piece. It's a living, breathing tradition, carried on in the same places where it was born. The stream is still flowing. The ultimate legacy of the Ashikaga experiment is a question that, much like the Ōnin garden, has no single, final answer. Historians can, and do, endlessly debate the shogun's motives and the effectiveness of their strategies. Was it a cynical power play wrapped in beautiful silk, or was it a genuine quest for a more profound way of life? Was it a glorious success or a tragic failure? The beauty of it is that we can hold both ideas in our minds at once. It was a politically fragile enterprise that gifted the world an incredibly durable and beautiful set of ideas. It was a marketing campaign that failed to save the company but ended up creating a timeless work of art. And so, you can leave the garden. You can walk back down the dewy path, past the stone basin, and out into the modern world. But the silence of the garden, The feeling of the imperfect tea bowl in your hands, the haunting image of the no mask, those things stay with you. They are the quiet echoes of a long ago governance attempt to build something beautiful and lasting in a violent and uncertain world. They are the whispers of a brand that found a way to achieve a kind of immortality, not through power, but through peace. And now the story is over. The battles have been fought, the tea has been drunk, and the gardens have fallen into the soft blues of twilight. All the noise of history, the clashing of swords, the whispered thoughts in palace corridors, the grand pronouncements of shoguns, it all fades away. It recedes, like a tide going out, leaving only the smooth, quiet end of the present moment. You can feel the weight of your own body, sinking gently into your bed. The air in the room is still and calm. The soft hum of the fan is like the distant sound of the wind, rustling through the pines behind the temple wall. You are here, in your own quiet space, your own sanctuary. The 15 rocks of Ōnin are settling in your mind, but you don't need to count them. You don't need to see them all. You can just let them be, islands in a calm sea of approaching sleep. Your thoughts can drift like those ghosts in the no place, not tormented, but finally at peace, dissolving into the gentle darkness. There is nothing left to do, nothing to figure out. The story is told. The day is done. Just the gentle, easy rhythm of your own breathing. In on doubt, a slow, quiet current carrying you out into the deep, peaceful ocean of your dreams.